advice that you've probably heard about 100 times before. And it's advice that's often given by people that have really no understanding of how to evaluate a track record. They give the advice, look for a fund with a good track record, but they really don't know what it means, and they really don't understand how to evaluate track record. And I'm talking about most advisors are in that boat, not just individual investors. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at track record, because track record really can be misleading. So the first thing I want to look at is I want to compare average rates of return versus actual rates of return. Now, I'm going to give you an example here to illustrate the difference. Let's take a scenario. Let's say that you bought a mutual fund and you paid $10,000. At the beginning of the year, you bought a brand new mutual fund, put $10,000 into it, you crossed your fingers and you hope for a great rate of return. And you watched that fund all year long, and let's say that fund in its first year had a fantastic year. Let's say it went up 100%. Okay, you'd be thrilled, because at the beginning of year 2, your account would now be worth 20 grand, right? 100% rate of return, it doubled over that year. And you've still got your fingers crossed because you want another return in year 2 like you had in year 1. But let's say that in year 2, this fund didn't have such a good year. Let's say it went down 50%. Okay, well, if the fund had a negative 50% return in year 2, that means that the value of your investment is back down to 10 grand, right? So your rate of return, if I asked you what's your rate of return, you wouldn't even need to pull out your calculator. You would tell me my rate of return is 0, right? Because you started with 10,000, you ended up with 10,000. Your rate of return over that period of time is 0. Now, the question I'd have for you is, what is the mutual fund? What's its average rate of return? What would the mutual fund report in the newspaper in its annual reports as its rate of return over that period? And this is where average rate of return looks very different than actual rate of return. So let's look at what a fund company would do. They would take those 2 years of rates of return, 100% and minus 50%, they'd add them together, and that would mean they'd end up with 50%, right? They divide that by the 2 years that the fund has been around. So starting in year 3, the fund company would report a 25% average rate of return for the first 2 years of 25%. Big difference. You got 0. That's your actual rate of return. But when you look at the track record, you look at the history of this fund is reporting an average rate of return of 25%. Now, you've got to look a lot deeper than just average rate of return. You've also got to look at actual rate of returns whenever you're evaluating any investments. Now, let's look at another example. Let's take a fund that has a 5-year average rate of return of 20%. Okay, so you've done your research, or your advisor has done some research. You come up with this mutual fund. It's attractive to you because over the last 5 years, it's been averaging 20% a year for the last 5 years. Now, you might be really interested in it until you look at the annual rates of return. And the annual rates of return, what an annual return is what the fund did in each of those years over the last 5 years. So if we look at that, let's assume that the fund in the first year went up 100%. But in each year after that, the fund did nothing. Well, if that's the case, if the fund went up 100% in the first year and it's done nothing for the next 4 years, it's got an average rate of return of 20%. Now, if all you're looking at is the average rate of return in the track record that way, you look at the fund, this particular fund, and you'd say, wow, that's a great average rate of return, I like it. But if you find out that the annual returns look like this, 100% in the first year, but the fund has done nothing over the last 4 years, don't you want to know that? Do you want to invest in a fund that hasn't delivered $1 of return in the last 4 years? Of course you want to know that, and it probably will influence whether or not you want to buy this fund or not. We also have to be very careful of annualized returns. And an annualized return is a rate of return that is a calculated return. It's an estimated return, and it's used for mutual funds that have a track record of less than 1 year. So let me give you an example. Let's say a mutual fund is brand new. It's only been around for 1 month. Okay? It was launched 1 month ago, and in its short life, over the last 30 days, the fund did really well. It went up 1% over the first 30 days of its life. A mutual fund company can now report to the world that it has an annualized rate of return of 12%. Because they just simply take that 1% it did in the first month, they assume that it's going to do that each month over the next year, and if we calculate what that return is over a year, it's 12%. But it's a completely meaningless number. Now, mutual fund companies have to tell you when it's an annualized return, that they've calculated the return, they're estimating it. They have to tell you. Most of the time they tell you with a little asterisk beside the rate of return number that you've got to go and search and find out what that means. Well, when you see the asterisk and you go read that it's actually an annualized return, ignore it, because annualized returns are completely meaningless. Now, when we're talking about track record, there's one principle that you've got to keep in mind, and that